webinar on legal and financial issues in rural parishes, and we're very thankful to have Peter Krege, Assistant to the President for Financial Planning and Control for the Missouri District of the LCMS, with us today. This is our second time having Peter. It's good to have you with us today. We'll go ahead and get started. I want to remind everybody that at the bottom left of your screen, there is a chat section. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type your questions into the chat section, and we will address them to Peter at the end of towards the end of our webinar today. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, our Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that you have given us such a great and awesome task to be about proclaiming your love in Jesus Christ to the world. Yet we know, Lord, that as sin-fallen human beings, we have to conduct our business, so to speak, in this sin-fallen world. And Lord, there are many issues that we need to address and to be aware of. And Lord, we give you thanks that there are folks who can give us direction and guidance on them. We give you thanks for Peter and his ministry with the Missouri District of the LCMS, and all of the folks who are here with us today, that they might learn and be encouraged and guided so as to conduct our work to your glory for the betterment of your kingdom. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I did want to give you a disclaimer that I am not an attorney, that I'm not here to give you legal advice. What I'm here to do is to make you aware of legal issues that face your congregation and maybe try to help you avoid some of the pitfalls that you can fall into. Working in the district office, I see occasional congregations that have stumbled, and hopefully we all can learn from mistakes others have made, as well as various sources of literature that I've read over the years and become familiar with, and I will give you at the very end some of those sources. So if we can move on to the first slide, then congregation. I've developed a picture, essentially a Venn diagram of what a congregation is, and I'm sure people read this, but I look at a congregation as being a spiritual community, a volunteer organization, and a legal entity. So obviously the spiritual is the church side, the volunteer is really the time, talents, and treasure of the congregation, and all the aspects that go with that, the work that's done in the church. And the legal then is that the corporation that exists, that is the framework of the congregation from a legal perspective. My view is that the smaller the intersection of the three, the more disorganized a congregation will be, and the opposite of that is the larger the common area is, the more harmonious a congregation will be. So with that, I wanted to specifically talk about the legal side. That's the focus today. The legal circle. Next slide, please. The congregation is a legal entity that is formed as a corporation in most instances. There are some congregations who are not corporations, but for the most part, congregations are formed as legal entities. They have certain legal documents that they created to form the congregation, and they have certain legal responsibilities, and I'll talk about those. They also have members, and we, as a congregation, we measure membership in a number of ways. Sunday morning worship attendance, we measure it in terms of baptized members or communicant members. Bylaws of a congregation or the articles of incorporation talk about the membership of the congregation, and it's usually the voter membership. And so those are the ones who are in charge of the legal. Then there is a concept called the public good, for the public good. And public good is what gives certain responsibilities and also certain privileges to a congregation. So a congregation is given by the IRS tax-exempt status, and this is not done out of the goodness of the IRS's heart. It's done because the congregation does things for the public good. So as we go through this today, I'll discuss a few of the items that the expectations that a congregation should have. So the legal documents of a congregation, first of all, you have your articles of incorporation. That's like your Declaration of Independence. That says, we want to exist to do, and then you fill in the blank. Then your bylaws are like the U.S. Constitution. That is, okay, we are setting these rules that we will abide by. In those rules are many things that talk about the governance of the organization. The bylaws also spell out your connection to Synod, and along with that, the confessions and the scripture and the adhere to as a congregation. So one of the things that when we talk about bylaws is that when you change your bylaws, those bylaws should be submitted to the district for. That's to keep that connection with district and synod whole and intact. We're not when the district reviews those, they may make suggestions about about legal issues within the bylaws, but mainly they're looking at the connection that you have, making you have the right wording as it relates to the bylaws of synod. Then we have other legal documents, deeds, contracts, leases, and those sorts of things that we entered into. And one of the issues that a congregation needs to wrestle with is who has the authority to enter into leases. Then you have other documents such as policies that are not in and of themselves legal documents, but yet if you end up in a court of law, these policies can be seen as having some legal influence on the congregation, the expectations of the, for example, employment policies. The employees have an expectation that those policies will be followed, and if you don't follow them, that problems for you. The procedures are how do you work with policies? What do you do day to day on the auspices of the policies? And again, those procedures, if you don't follow them correctly, it's been said many times that it's better sometimes not to have a policy than to have a policy that you're not following. We also, in the Lutheran Church, have other documents that we follow, specifically the Bible and the confessions, that distinguish us from the secular world, and they are referenced in our bylaws. So we need to be aware of that when we're dealing with any legal issues. Is that we have said that we will follow the scripture, we will follow the confession, and we will also follow the handbook of synod. So sometimes, in the instance of a worker, for example, who is rostered on synod's roster, those workers have certain rights and responsibilities, and there's for example a grievance policy. I should just call it a dispute resolution policy that exists that should be followed, and if you don't follow that, that can get you to your mission statement, vision statement, goals and objectives. Those are items that you create as a congregation. Then the leaders of the congregation have a responsibility to follow that mission and create their own mission and vision and goals and objectives, but rather work as a congregation as a whole. The next slide shows then the top 5 reasons why congregations ended up in court. This list was compiled by an attorney attorney who's also a CPA that reviews every legal case in the United States that leads to a congregation. He does this year in and year out, and so the top 5 are sex with the child, and that's fairly self-explanatory. You have personal injury, is slips and falls, and that sort of thing, and that not a lawsuit. Insurance, and that's where you have an issue with your insurance company. So a personal injury may occur, and the insurance company says, "Well, we'll cover it." Well, why do they not cover it? Some of the common reasons for disputes with the insurance company, there are exclusions in the insurance policy that congregations might not be aware of. One is the intentional misconduct exclusion. So if misconduct occurs, in other words, the congregation is breaking the law, the insurance company isn't going to the congregation. Another one, which is a big one, is employment practices exclusion. You can get coverage for employment practices, but in your general policy it may be excluded. So you want to make sure that your policy does cover employment practices, so that if you have a dispute with an employee, that property disputes, those are things often come up when the congregation goes into a building. Suddenly they run into, they look at their deed, which they haven't done recently, discover that the property was donated by someone who said, well, this property can only be used XYZ, and the congregation wants to do ABC. So that may be one issue. Another issue could be where a congregation has given a right-of-way to someone, and then there's right-of-way around that right-of-way may have become eroded, and so no one's really clear on exactly what that right-of-way is. Just boundaries. Where's the boundary to the bottom? Zoning disputes, signage is probably the big one there. If a congregation wants to put up a sign, or usage. But, if the congregation decides they want to, for example, start a day school and they want to put up a great big sign, or check their zoning laws before they put that sign. Go and get variances of that if they need to. And okay, next slide then is fiduciary responsibilities of officers. There is a protection for officers of a congregation, but they have to follow certain guidelines. So if you can forward to the next slide, please. The fiduciary responsibilities include the duty of loyalty, the duty of care, and the duty of obedience. And duty of loyalty says that an officer of a congregation must act in the best interest of the congregation, and not in the interest of another organization or person. And so a conflict of interest policy is the way that you make sure that you are following that duty of loyalty. One example might be that if you have some work that needs to be done around the church, and a trustee says, well, I have a business, I can do that. You don't want to just outright give a contract to that person without doing some due diligence and outside bidding, and also defining what the project is. So, if plowing snow in the wintertime, what are the rules around that? Every time the snow exceeds 2 inches, or sidewalks 2, or just the parking lot, and all that kind of stuff. Duty of care is acting in a manner that an ordinarily prudent person would act. That is attending meetings, or on the governing board of the congregation. Your attendance at meetings is expected, and that you stay and maintain informed not at meetings, you really don't know what's going on. But then you need to go beyond that and say, okay, well, specific project, then I may need to myself about exactly that entails, do some research or the library or on the internet, whatever. Duty of care doesn't say that you cannot delegate responsibility. You can delegate, but you must also have oversight. So you should have systems in place for oversight. Some systems that you might have would be performance and internal controls on your accounting system. Would be two types of systems. Duty of obedience is that the congregation and the individual obeys the laws of the land, laws of the county, the laws of the city, whatever apply. Duty of obedience also means that you stay with your charitable religious purpose, that you follow the scriptures and confessions, that it's handlaws, handbook, as well as your own congregation's bylaws. Next slide, please. Legal responsibilities as they relate to the IRS. IRS has a number of issues that you need to be aware of. The first one is the housing allowance. Declaration of the housing allowance needs to be done annually before the beginning of the year or before the housing allowance is given to the worker. Not go backwards and retroactively say, well, we will give things in April, we won't say effective January. The housing allowance really is a tax benefit to the roster church workers, so for your pastor and others. It doesn't cost the congregation anything extra, and so the idea with the housing allowance is to make it as liberal as possible. There are other worker, for example, the fair rental value of the home. But the congregation doesn't need to concern itself with that. The congregation could simply declare the housing allowance as an adequate amount. Yes.
I hate to interrupt. We're starting to lose some of the audio. If maybe you could move a little closer to the microphone.
Okay. Does that work any better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I was talking about private annulment. Private annulment is that thing that I talked about earlier about we have certain rights and responsibilities that we carry out for the public good. Well, private annulment simply means that you're giving something to an individual that he probably shouldn't be getting from a tax-exempt organization. So if you are overpaying a worker, there are certain limitations on how much you can pay a worker. Most of us don't have to worry about that because we don't have the funding to overpay. But private annulment would also come up if you close down a congregation. You can't just say, okay, all the members of the congregation will get X percent of the proceeds. That's why there is a reversionary clause in the documents. Being a conduit to avoid taxes, that's also prohibited. This might come up if the congregation has a school, and rather than charge tuition, you tell the parents of the children in the school that they are expected to give a certain amount to the congregation as a way of avoiding taxes. There has to be a link there, but it needs to be very clear if you are offering free tuition that it's done without any coercion towards the parents of the school, for example, acting as a conduit to avoid taxes. Receiving of gifts, there are certain legal responsibilities with receiving of gifts. Usually those are in the areas of cash, gifts that are in excess of $250, and gifts of non-cash items as well. There are specific IRS forms for gifts over $5,000 and over $10,000. That would be typically someone who may want to give some stock or something like that to the congregation. Tax exemption, your congregation has a tax exemption through the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. That I'm assuming everyone here is a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So all congregations, including those who are in the formative state, are tax exempt because of this group letter ruling. You may still apply for a tax exemption, though, for your payroll purposes, or rather not a tax exemption, but a tax number, a tax ID number. You would need that to file W-2s and 1099s and those sorts of forms. And then your congregation should also have a state tax ID number in most states. Your legal responsibility is also to remit taxes that are withheld. Once you do your payroll and you take taxes out of a person's paycheck, that money no longer belongs to the congregation. That money belongs to the taxing authority. And if you divert funds from the taxing authorities, they are not very happy about that. And they will come down not only on the congregation itself, but also the officers of the congregation or those who are responsible for remitting those funds to the IRS and other agencies like that. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about the duty of care and obedience and internal controls. Internal controls is separation of duties, and the way you have good internal controls is you separate functions. The function of possession of funds should be separated from the recording of funds, and those two should be separate from the approval of funds. The congregation, this would work in the following manner. Typically, the possession of funds would be the counters, those people who count the money. They should be a minimum of 2 individuals, unrelated. They typically would take the offering from the altar and take it to a room and count it, maybe do some preliminary recording of who gave what, opening up all the envelopes and what was in the envelope and that sort of thing, and then make the deposit. Once the money is counted, one person could make the deposit. 2 people don't need to go to the bank. 1 is plenty. Then the recording secretary, the financial secretary of the congregation, would record the funds. So the unofficial records from the counters would then be passed on to the financial secretary, who would enter them in the financial records of the congregation and should be looking at the total that the counters entered and make sure that that agrees. And then the financial secretary may also cut checks. So he may have in his possession the checkbook and write the checks, but the checks don't actually get signed or sent out until the treasurer. That's the third step then, the approval. Treasurer approves, or whoever. It could be department heads first if you have a larger congregation. The approvals are made, the checks are signed, and then they get sent out. Then you also want to have some external oversight. So a financial review committee, a finance committee that conducts a financial review. And then occasionally some congregations have audits. Audits are fairly technical, and so you don't want to call a financial review an audit. An audit says that you are following generally accepted accounting principles, and as such, most congregations are not. Most congregations work on a cash basis, not an accrual basis. Most congregations don't have a balance sheet, or if they do, it's not very extensive. And so an audit wouldn't work very well. But yet you can bring in outside people to occasionally review as an additional step. Another item might be that Another way for to have accountability is have an organizational chart. So an organizational chart would lay out who is responsible for what, who reports to whom, even with respect to volunteers and boards and committees. So that just helps give a defined line of who to go to when you have an issue with a certain problem. The employment issues that you may face, ministry descriptions and reviews. Every worker, like I said, even volunteers, should have ministry descriptions and performance reviews. Performance reviews are not about pay. They're about giving feedback and also documenting when an issue does arise. You want to document what that issue is, that you've talked about it, you've come to an agreement as to how to change, if it's bad behavior or something like that, how to change that behavior. And then, what the next steps are, and hopefully you have a personnel manual that talks about what your progressive discipline is if that's needed. But again, performance reviews should not be viewed as adversarial, but more as giving feedback to the worker. Non-discrimination laws do apply to congregations. There is an exception, pretty narrow, and it deals with the discrimination based on religion, and we are allowed to discriminate, but only for certain positions. So for a pastor, that would be perfectly acceptable. For a janitor, that probably doesn't apply. So you need to be careful and not discriminate on any basis. Another area, wage and hour laws. That's an area where I believe that many congregations are not in compliance with the law. Secretaries often are told and paid as if they are exempt employees. That is, they're not entitled to overtime. They just simply receive a salary, and if they work more, well, that's okay. That worker is volunteering, and that worker may even say that. But if a dispute arises and the wage and hour people are called in, then the first question they ask is, well, do you ever work time that's not recorded? And the answer would be yes. And then you owe back wages plus penalties, that sort of thing. So you should follow wage and hour laws, and specifically in regard to secretaries, make sure that they are treated as hourly employees and keep time records and sign the time records. Personnel policies should be created. They should be documented and acknowledged by the employees. So once a personnel manual is put into place, there should be a page that says, I've received this personnel manual and agree to abide by it. And if they don't, then they probably shouldn't be working there. Another thing that's not on the slide that's important is workers' compensation insurance. Some congregations are under the impression that they don't need workers' compensation insurance because Concordia plans would cover them if something happened, if they were injured. And that does not, Concordia plans does not cover workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is a specific insurance that covers employers and also protects employers, so that there are limits that are placed on certain claims. For example, if a worker loses a leg, that's a pretty bad example, but there would be a limit as to how much they could collect from insurance for that purpose if you have workers' compensation insurance. If you don't, then there's all the other laws that would apply, and there would be no limitation by workers' compensation. So for your congregation's sake, you should make sure that your congregation offers workers' compensation insurance to all workers. Next slide, about legal responsibilities related to certain funds. I already talked a little bit about withheld taxes, and that those become trust funds once they are withheld. Another area is cemetery endowments. Congregations are often tempted to borrow against the cemetery endowment. other endowments, and they, the rationale is, well, we'll pay ourselves interest, and instead of the bank paying us interest. But the fact is that if you are engaging in that kind of activity, you have a conflict of interest, and everybody in the meeting has a conflict of interest. And so you essentially don't have any protection if something goes wrong. And I've seen many instances where something does go wrong. The cemetery endowment is depleted, and now the cemetery work needs to be done. And okay, now what are we going to do? Spend all the money. We don't have any money in the church coffers, so just don't do it. If you want to invest the funds, invest them with an entity such as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Foundation, and just keep that separate from the funds of the congregation as a whole. I want to talk a little bit about restricted gifts versus designated gifts. Restricted gifts are restricted by a donor. A donor makes a restriction, and that restriction then it becomes a legal responsibility of the recipient that you follow that restriction. On the other hand, designated gifts come in. Actually, the gifts aren't designated when they come in. A donor maybe as a bequest in their will, they leave a gift to the congregation. Congregation then in the next voters meeting decides that they're going to put that money into a, you name the fund, let's call it the building fund. That is designated, money designated by the congregation. If the congregation designates it, it can redesignate it or undesignate it. It is not restricted. So there's no legal responsibility other than that you use it for the congregation. But a restricted fund you have to use for the purpose intended. Next slide, please. Legal responsibilities regarding child abuse. What to do. Child abuse is if you have an actual or reasonable suspicion that physical, sexual, emotional abuse or neglect has taken place or is taking place by a parent or guardian or someone else, that you report that and report it to the police, to a child abuse hotline. There is a national child abuse hotline if you don't know where else to go. Phone number is 1-800-4A-CHILD. Department of Children's Services in most states. You'll have some kind of a Department of Human Services, Department of Child Services. So whenever there is even a suspicion of child abuse, make sure you report it. There is a clergy penitent privilege that differs by state, but in most instances there is some leeway for pastors under this law, but each state has different take on it. So most of the pastors would already know what those rules are. And then who is a child? Well, a child is, up to 18 years old is a child. So you need to be very careful just because a child is older and, maybe, you see a bruise on them. Well, we're not going to report that. Well, investigate it, and if it's, if there's a reasonable suspicion that something isn't right, then you should be reporting it. Next slide. Sexual misconduct is an area that you can be well aware of, and create policies that protect minors before something happens. And so protection policies would include things like doing background checks, the 6-month rule, teaching and training those who work with minors. When you're talking about youth group, junior or senior high kids, or even younger kids, and Sunday school, you have a Sunday school, the door's closed and no one's in there, whatever thing you can put into place, put into place. Your insurance company will provide a lot of resources for you in this regard. You can create policies based on the materials that your insurance company will give to you. Mandatory reporting, state laws govern mandatory reporting, but the rule of thumb is when in doubt, report it. Way better to protect children than to let something go and then find out later on that something went wrong. Also, I'll cover this in the next slide. Next slide, please. The responsibilities for internet and communications that you do with regard to minors, especially if you print photos on the web, you have copyrighted materials, public prayer requests. You always want to be sensitive to who could see that, what they may do with it from a negative point of view. Obtain permission from parents if you're using pictures of minors. So you need to obtain permission if you use copyrighted materials, and then even prayer requests. People may not want their names out on the internet. If you have an illness, make sure that you check with them before you put things like that out there. There's a law that on the books about cribs, that slabbed cribs, they are dangerous and illegal. That the law is in effect. There was a time when it was implemented. It is now in effect, and I can tell you from personal experience that cribs can be dangerous. I had a daughter that got her knee stuck in between the slabs of a crib, and my wife had to go get the neighbor to get her out. So if you have those cribs, slabbed cribs, make sure you remove them. And don't sell them to somebody, throw them away, destroy them. Protecting from pornography on a website, but not just pornography, gambling, all sorts of things that the church simply doesn't stand for. You want to have a firewall in place with filters that protect people who are accessing it. Minor or distracted drivers, that's another area. If you have a youth group and you're going on a field trip somewhere, don't have a minor drive the car. And ensure that even if it's an adult who's driving the car, that they understand that if their phone rings or someone texts them, that they should not answer that phone without pulling over. Lawsuits regarding that sort of thing, not just against churches, but against businesses as well. It's an upcoming, that's getting bigger and bigger. Another thing with computers at the church is that if the computer is the property of the church, that segregation really should make it clear that there is no expectation of privacy when it comes to that. So if to the pastor or the secretary or whomever, that there should be no expectation of privacy. Now there may be some rules. For example, a pastor has the privilege, and so you don't want everybody to have either. But there need to be some rules so that the pastor's not going on and looking at pornography on a website in the church office. That pretty much concludes the comments that I have. I do have some resources. That website that's up on the screen right now is the LCMS website, www.lcms.org. It's really difficult to find things on the website, so you want to make sure that you write down the entire URL. That URL has a lot of resource materials related to human resources. It has the Congregational Treasurer's Manual. I believe it even has the group purchasing agreements on that page. There's a lot of material there that would be helpful regarding the legal issues that I talked about today. Another source that I use quite extensively is there's a CPA attorney by the name of Richard Hammer, and he has a number of materials that are available. If you ever go to their website, you'll probably never stop receiving stuff from their website. But he puts out church tax and legal letter. He puts out a church and clergy tax guide and pastor and church law books. All of those are good resources, depending on how in-depth you want to get. On the other hand, you may just want to, when these issues come up, consult with your district office. The business manager in your district office could probably provide you with the resources you need. So with that, I think we could probably go to questions.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is in quotation marks from their restricted gifts for regular church payments.
Well, I talked about that a little bit already, that, yeah, you can, but first of all, everybody in the room has a conflict of interest in that regard. So you're really in dangerous water from a personal point of view and from the congregation's point of view. And if something, if everything goes right, it's not a problem. But if something goes wrong, then it could be a big problem. And so I would say that where you can, you don't want to.
As Paul says, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay. Another question with regard, I know oftentimes when people are elected to positions within a congregation, they do so out of obligation. They do so out of nobody else will do it. Is there a resource out there for doing training of officers so that they can understand the gravity or maybe the importance of what it is that they're signing on to do?
Well, I know that in the St. Louis area that there is a local college has not-for-profit type training, so that would be one place to go. There are seminars that are held, I know, all around the country regarding not-for-profit training. Your district may put on training specific. A lot of times when there are congregational treasure workshops, they really are way beyond just the treasurer, and they do talk about all the officers. And I would say that the Congregational Treasurer's Manual itself probably is a good resource. Probably the best resource. I failed to mention that, but the Congregational Treasurer's Manual is probably the best resource out there for congregations as a whole as it relates to business and legal matters.
Thank you. And again, that resource is available via that link. If you need that link or any of that information, please contact our office. We'd be glad to provide that for you. Another question we have here, Peter, is regarding restricted gifts. Can a congregation work with the donor if what the donor desires to contribute to is maybe not in the best interest of the congregation?
Well, that's an area that really, it happens. Usually, the gift comes in after a person has, deceased or something like that. If you're talking about a major gift, but in many instances, you can speak to the donor or the donor's family, and redirect the gift or make it so that the gift does work with the congregation, with the intent of the congregation, what the congregation wants. But on the other hand, the congregation also has a right to refuse a gift. Just because somebody wants to give a gift and create something, make something happen, doesn't mean the congregation needs to accept the gift and make that happen.
Very good.
So best thing is try to redirect. If you can't redirect, then don't accept.
Good. Sometimes getting money isn't always the best thing. Another question here. How can a church avoid a conflict of interest concerning internal controls with rural parishes with few members and all of them related? These family churches.
You do the best you can. I mean, if you have 3 members, really 4 members, you could do the separation of duties. But yes, I understand that that could be an issue in a small parish. If you have 2 unrelated people counting, I didn't mention that all 4 of those people really should be unrelated. And yes, if they're all related, then you do what you can. And sometimes what you have to do then is, you can't segregate those functions, but then on the other end where you do the review, the financial review, for example, then you make sure that that is maybe a little more intense, that you have a little bit of segregation on that end. So you do the best you can, and then compensate in other ways wherever you can as well.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that was, we had another question very similar to that. He asked if there was a minimum number of people to have in handling that money regarding that lack of people, or the minimum number for the separation of duties. So a very similar question. I don't see that we have any other questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, ideally the number would be at least 4, but
at least 4. 4 plus what?
A finance committee, a committee that does a financial review, annually or periodically. By the way, there is a financial review segment in the Congregational Treasurer's Manual, and it's very extensive and it's labor intensive as well. And what a congregation can do is focus on different areas of a financial review each year, so that it's not so burdensome. So one year you may look at accounts receivable, and next year you look at accounts payable, and that sort of thing.
Okay, we just had another question come in. Could a congregation have a financial secretary or treasurer from outside the congregation?
Yes. Obviously you'd have to look at your bylaws, but any corporation can hire a person, for example, and so if you can hire a person from the outside, you can just as easily bring someone in from another congregation. That actually may be a way to work towards some of these controls, is to work with other congregations in your circuit or in your area, and maybe create a financial review committee that goes around to 3 or 4 or 5 different congregations in the circuit. That may be a way for you to get some controls that you otherwise wouldn't have because of the size of the smaller congregation.
Thank you. Also, a question on closing congregations. Legal financial issues regarding when a congregation decides to close. What do they have to consider?
So, a couple things that I've seen. First of all, is that when a congregation closes, if you remember the circles, the very first slide that was up there, there are different aspects to the congregation. So on the spiritual circle, what you would have is closing the congregation as far as your final worship service and your relationship to Synod and that sort of thing. But then you have the legal congregation, that other circle, and so if the congregation closes as its closing worship service, what you want to do is make sure that there is a resolution on the books before the congregation closes that gives authority for the officers to carry out the closing of the congregation in a legal manner, and then work with an attorney to carry out the legal manner. Then you have the assets of the congregation, distributing those. I talked about private inurement. Private, you want to make sure that then the assets of the congregation go to a not-for-profit entity. Your bylaws probably specify what entity that is. It's probably the district or Synod. But whatever that is, you want to make sure that gets carried out properly. And then in the end, you want to go to your Secretary of State.
Sorry, we had a little announcement made here. Another question. Any thoughts that should be given concerning compensation for part-time secretaries or organists?
Just that, secretaries, I talked about that a little bit already, about the wage and hour laws. yeah, you want to make sure that you are paying them on an hourly basis. The risk with the secretary, if they are a member of the congregation, is that they may work 3 days a week or 2 days a week or 5 days a week. And then they come in on Sunday morning and, oh, we don't have enough bulletins. Would you please run off some bulletins? Well, that's part of that secretary's job. And so that secretary should then be paid for that. So that's a risk that you run into with secretaries. Organists, usually if you pay them, you're paying them enough to cover at least more than the minimum wage, and you just spell out that you're paying them on a per service basis, or whatever basis you're paying them on a per week basis to for 3 worship services. There's a lot that goes into being an organist, choir, rehearsing with the choir. So there's a lot of time to consider that's behind the scenes. It's not just Sunday morning.
Right. Another question here regarding work comp coverage. Is work comp coverage for volunteers something to consider in a small church?
I'm not sure that work comp is available for volunteers, but there's other insurance that you can get to cover volunteers. So, and yes, you definitely want to consider that. That goes into more the personal injury side of insurance then.
And liability issues?
There is a person in at the Synod's office. Her name is Denise Webb, and if you have specific insurance questions, she is a great resource.
Okay, Denise Webb at the Synod. We don't have her direct line, but we did have one of our. The pastor did not declare his exemption from Social Security when he was ordained. Can he do that years later?
I don't believe so. That's a fairly technical question. There's a person that could probably help you with that, but I think the answer is no.
Okay.
The IRS, it has to be based on the congregation or the theology of our church body. And so, if you've not declared exemption from Social Security right out of the box, then you'd have a hard time saying that.
Pastor Kearns had mentioned there's a 2-year window, so.
Yeah, I believe that's true.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't want to cut us off early. Great questions today. So one question we did have a little bit ago, one of our listeners asked if you, Peter, would be available personally to receive maybe some email questions afterwards. Would that be possible?
No problem.
Okay.
The first slide had I believe it had my email address on it. My email address is my name with a dot in between, so it's peter.krege at mo, like Missouri, .lcms.org.
I went ahead and put that in the chat. It's been peter.krege. I didn't put it in right. Peter.krege at mo.
Yes, the way it's on the chat is correct. No, there should be an @ sign.
Yeah, I left the @ sign out. All righty, looks like we have it. Okay, we don't. Okay, here we go. Pastor News had mentioned he was asking about Social Security. He says he's still in Social Security, but they are taking steps to reduce his compensation while having the congregation pick up some expenses like internet service, cell phone, etc. Any cautions to keep in mind when doing some of those add-on pay things?
Well, essentially, anything that you get paid should be taxable unless items are being reimbursed under an accountable plan. The Congregational Treasurer's Manual talks about accountable plans and what's required. Essentially, you need to keep records of the internet and the business purpose and why you're using the whatever it is, the cell phone. Cell phones are actually okay now. There used to be some restrictions, but cell phones are a little more open now. So yes, the congregation can pick up those expenses. It may be taxable, but on the other hand, if you are reimbursed for those expenses under an accountable plan, you have the right accounting for that, then that would not be a taxable item.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Okay. I don't believe we have any other questions at the moment. They keep giving school announcements here that we can't seem to get cut off. Sorry about that, folks. A little technical issue. Students need to be somewhere special, I guess. So anyway, I don't see any other questions. Amy has put a couple of important dates off to the side. Scott Kearns had asked, Pastor Kearns asked about laptops or cell phone, I guess, regarding maybe reimbursement. I think we...
Yeah, for cell phones, reimbursing for cell phones, I think that's appropriate now. Like I said, there used to be something that actually fell under the private inurement rules that prohibited cell phones, but that has changed. Laptops, the thing to do there is just have the congregation provide the laptop. That's okay. I guess you'd have to say, well, is it business related or is it personal, and you may have an issue there. But typically, a laptop is considered a work tool, and so it should be something that the congregation can provide without any tax consequence to the worker.
Very good. I tell you what, thank you very much, Peter, for your time today and all this information. This was fantastic. A little reminder to the folks out there, we've got another webinar coming up Thursday, May 15th, New and Invigorating Approaches to Witness and Outreach. This will be put on by Lee Larson, who's the ministry coordinator for Acts 1-8 Ministry out of Wisconsin. Also, we have a couple of Engaging Your Community events coming up. The first one will be May 3rd at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Honey Creek, Missouri. That's over just outside of Jeff City here in the Missouri District. And we also are doing one up in Mount Ayr, Iowa. That'll be at Trinity in Mount Ayr, and that's in the Iowa District West. If you are anywhere near those, we encourage you to take advantage of those Engaging Your Community events. And a reminder that the registration is now open for our third National Mission Conference, which will be held at the Kansas City Airport Marriott in Kansas City from Thursday, November 6th through Saturday, November 8th. You don't want to miss that. We've got the presidents of both of our seminaries presenting, as well as many, many other good topics that you'll want to take advantage of. So check all that out on the web. I don't see any more questions coming in. So again, thank you very much, Peter, for your time and your information today. God's blessings to you all.
Thank you.